July 1944, Normandy, France. The wheat fields south of Caen were burning. Lieutenant Jack McLeod stood in the turret of his Sherman tank and counted the black smoke columns rising into the morning sky. 1, 2, 3. He stopped at 23. 23 Canadian tanks destroyed in just 6 weeks of fighting since D-Day. Each smoke column meant 4 or 5 men dead or badly burned. McLeod was 28 years old. Before the war, he ran a 400-acre wheat farm outside Sherbrooke, Quebec. He knew how to fix tractors when they broke down in the middle of harvest. He understood machines the way his father and grandfather had understood them. Not from books, but from working with them every single day until his hands knew what to do before his brain finished thinking. The math was simple and terrible. For every German tank the Canadians destroyed, they lost 5 Shermans. The Sherman's 75mm gun could punch through a Tiger tank's armor at 500 yards, but a Tiger's 88mm gun could kill a Sherman from 2,000 yards away. The Germans could sit far back and pick off Shermans like shooting ducks on a pond. The British officers had a saying about this problem. They said the only way to beat a Tiger was to call in the bombers. They said tank commanders should avoid fighting other tanks. They said to wait, to be patient, to let the Air Force handle the heavy German armor. The Americans agreed. Their tank manual said to find defensive positions and hold ground, not to seek out German tanks. McLeod lit a cigarette and watched another Sherman brew up in the distance. Brew up. That's what the crews called it when a tank caught fire. The gasoline ignited fast. The ammunition cooked off with sharp cracks. Men had about 15 seconds to get out before the whole thing exploded. Sometimes they made it. Most times they didn't. His own tank sat in a shallow dip between 2 hedgerows. The French called these hedgerows bocage. They were ancient property lines, thick walls of dirt and roots and bushes that divided every farm field. McLeod studied them through his binoculars. They reminded him of something. The tree-lined farm roads back home in Quebec looked just like this. Narrow passages, tight corners, places where you couldn't see what was coming until you were right on top of it. A British major had visited B Squadron yesterday. He looked at McLeod's uniform and wrinkled his nose. "Colonials playing soldier," he muttered to his aide. The aide laughed. McLeod said nothing. He'd heard worse. The British tank officers thought Canadians were farmers and loggers who didn't know real warfare. Maybe they were right. McLeod had never been to a fancy military school. He'd learned to fight in a Sherman tank by fighting in a Sherman tank. His crew was good. Corporal Rudolph was the gunner who handled the main gun. Trooper Moreau loaded the shells with speed that came from years of hauling grain sacks. Driver Hall knew the tank's engine sounds like a doctor knew a heartbeat. Trooper White handled the bow machine gun and could hit a running man at 300 yards. They'd all survived 6 weeks of combat since landing at Juno Beach on D-Day. That made them lucky, or skilled, or both. McLeod called his tank Bomb. All the tanks in B Squadron had names starting with B Barbara. Be good, brave. His crew had picked Bomb because of the grenade symbol on their regimental badge. The name felt right. They were sitting on 30 tons of armor, fuel, and ammunition. One good hit, and they'd explode like a bomb anyway. July 18th arrived with gray skies and distant thunder. Except it wasn't thunder. It was Operation Goodwood. The biggest Allied tank attack since D-Day began 6 weeks ago. British and Canadian tanks were rolling south toward Caen in 3 massive columns. McLeod watched them go, over 700 tanks. Surely that many tanks could break through. By noon, the radio was chaos. Tank commanders screaming, officers calling for help. Medics needed everywhere. McLeod climbed out of Bomb and walked to a small rise where he could see the battlefield. His stomach turned cold. The German tanks were dug in along a ridge. Tigers, Panthers, 88s hidden in the tree lines. They were firing down into the columns of British and Canadian armor, like shooting fish in a barrel. The Shermans tried to shoot back, but the range was too far. Their shells bounced off the German armor or fell short. The Tigers didn't miss. Every shot found a target. McLeod counted the burning hulks. 50, 70, 100. The number kept climbing. By the time the attack stalled and the survivors pulled back, 200 Allied tanks sat destroyed in the open fields. 200 tanks gone in one morning. B Squadron got orders that evening. Tomorrow they would join the attack. McLeod gathered his crew around Baum as the sun set. Hall was cleaning the engine filters. Morault was organizing ammunition. Rudolph was checking the gun's hydraulics. White was writing a letter home. McLeod pulled out his map and spread it on Baum's front armor. He pointed to the open ground where all those tanks had died today. "They want us to cross this tomorrow," he said. His crew stopped working and gathered around. They looked at the map. They looked at the smoke still rising from the day's battle. Nobody said anything for a long moment. "The British way isn't working," McLeod said. "The American way isn't working. Charging across open ground at dug-in Tigers isn't working." He traced his finger along the hedgerows on the map. "But look at this. These bocage rows. They're tight. They're covered. They're just like the farm roads back in Quebec." Rudolph squinted at the map. "You want to ambush them?" "I want to stop fighting their war," McLeod said, "and start fighting ours." White looked up from his letter. "The major said to follow doctrine, stay in formation, advance in line." McLeod folded the map and looked at his crew. "Doctrine says we should all be dead by now. We're farmers and factory workers. We fix machines. We know ground. We don't know fancy tactics, but we know this. You don't fight a bear in an open field. You fight it in the woods where size doesn't matter as much." He tapped the map. "These hedgerows are our woods." The question hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Could a farm boy's intuition beat the experts? Could 5 Canadians in a 30-ton Sherman change the mathematics of a battle they were supposed to lose? That night, while his crew slept, McLeod sat in Baum's turret thinking about machines. Back on the farm, when a combine broke down during harvest, you didn't call the dealer and wait 3 days for a part. You fixed it with what you had: wire, spare bolts, sometimes a piece of wood hammered into place. The Sherman was the same way. It wasn't the fanciest tank, it wasn't the most powerful, but it was reliable. It could be fixed. It could keep working when fancier machines quit. He pulled out a notebook and started writing. His rules. Not the kind they taught at military school, the kind a farmer learned from 20 years of working land and machinery. Rule 1. Never fight in open ground. Just like you never tried to plow rocky soil. You'd break your equipment and waste your time. Find the soft ground. Find the covered ground. Rule 2. Use the terrain like you use farm equipment. Those hedgerows weren't obstacles. They were windbreaks. They were cover. They were natural walls that could hide a 30-ton tank as well as they hid a tractor. Rule 3. Get close before you shoot. A Sherman's gun could punch through a Panther's side armor at 150 yards. That close, the German tanks couldn't turn their turrets fast enough. Their size worked against them in tight spaces. Rule 4. Keep the same crew. On the farm, a harvest team worked together for years. They knew each other's movements. They didn't need to talk to know what came next. Tank crews should work the same way. McLeod closed the notebook as dawn broke. He knew what the officers would say. They'd call it reckless. They'd say he was gambling with men's lives. But those same officers had just watched 200 tanks burn, following their textbook tactics. 4 days later, B Squadron got their chance. July 22nd. The regiment moved to positions near a village called Saint-André-sur-Orne. German infantry was pushing south with tank support. B Squadron's job was to stop them. McLeod found an orchard on the edge of town, apple trees in neat rows, a low stone wall running along one side. Perfect. He positioned bomb behind the wall, where the trees made shadows even in daylight. He had Hall drive forward until the gun barrel barely cleared the wall. From the road, you couldn't see them. They were just another dark shape in the orchard. The other tanks in the squadron spread out using the hedgerows and farm buildings. 15 Shermans total. McLeod radioed each commander. Nobody fires until I do. Wait until they're close. Wait until you can't miss. The wait felt like hours. Morault checked and rechecked the ammunition. 75mm shells stacked in their racks. High explosive. Armor piercing. White smoke rounds for marking targets. Rudolph tested the turret traverse. Left, right, smooth and quiet. Hall kept the engine running low. Just enough power to move fast if they needed to. The sound came first. The squealing grind of tank tracks on pavement. Then the shapes. German Panzer. Mark IVs. Big and boxy. Their long guns swinging back and forth as they scanned the roads. Behind them, infantry in half tracks. Behind them, something bigger. McLeod felt his mouth go dry. Panthers. 3 of them. 45-ton monsters with sloped armor that could bounce off most Allied shells. The lead Panzer rolled past at 200 yards, then 150. McLeod watched through his periscope. His hand gripped the radio switch. Wait, 100 yards. The Panzer's turret faced forward. The crew inside had no idea 15 Shermans were hidden in the orchards and hedgerows around them. Fire, McLeod said. Rudolph fired. The 75mm gun kicked back with a boom that shook the whole tank. The smell of cordite filled the turret. Through the smoke, McLeod saw the armor-piercing round punch into the Panzer's side. Sparks. Then flame. The Panzer lurched to a stop. All around the orchard, Shermans opened fire. The Germans never had a chance to return fire properly. They were bunched on the road. They couldn't see where the shots came from. 15 tanks shooting at once from 3 sides. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. 30 minutes. That's how long it lasted. When the smoke cleared, 15 German tanks sat burning. 2 of those kills belonged to bomb. McLeod's crew had reloaded and fired 6 times. The gun got so hot they had to pour water on it. But the cost came too. 10 of B Squadron's 15 Shermans took hits. Some burned, some threw tracks, some lost crew members to shrapnel. Only 5 tanks could still fight. Bomb was one of them, not a scratch. The British Major General arrived that evening. He looked at the destroyed German tanks. He looked at McLeod. That was reckless gambling, Lieutenant. You positioned your tanks in ambush instead of maintaining formation. You ignored doctrine. You got lucky this time, but luck runs out. McLeod said nothing. He'd learned that arguing with officers was pointless. But Lieutenant Colonel Mel Gordon saw something different. Gordon commanded the whole Sherbrooke Fusiliers Regiment. He was older, maybe 45, with gray in his hair and scars from the last war. He walked the battlefield counting German tanks, counting Canadian tanks, doing the math. That night Gordon found McLeod cleaning his gun. Your crew has a 100% survival rate, Gordon said, and more confirmed kills than any other tank in the regiment. I don't care what the British think. I care what works. He lit a cigarette and handed one to McLeod. You have tactical autonomy, Lieutenant. Fight your farm boy war. McLeod felt something release in his chest. Permission, finally. Over the next week, McLeod taught the surviving crews his system. They gathered in a barn where they could spread maps and draw diagrams. He showed them how to read the ground, how to find positions before dawn, how to punch firing holes through stone walls using pickaxes and pry bars. The chateau at La Jalousie had walls 3 feet thick. McLeod's crew spent a night knocking holes through that stone. Come morning, they had perfect firing ports that looked like windows from outside. He taught them to coordinate with infantry. The foot soldiers could scout ahead and radio back German positions. They could protect the tanks from enemy infantry with grenades and rifles. He taught them to target the tracks first, then the turret. A tank without tracks couldn't chase you. A tank without a turret couldn't shoot back. He taught them to move after every engagement, fire from one position, relocate immediately. The Germans would shell the first position. You'd already be gone. Farmers called it crop rotation. Tank crews should call it survival. The numbers started mattering. Average engagement range dropped to 152 yards. At that distance, a Sherman 75mm gun punched through Panther side armor 95 times out of 100. Bomb's crew got their reload time down to 4.8 seconds. The manual said 6 to 7 seconds, but the manual wasn't written by farm boys who'd spent years loading hay bales in rhythm with their brothers. McLeod had them practice relocations, 6 to 8 positions per day. Never stay in the same spot. Never become predictable. The Germans were learning. They'd mortar any position where a Sherman fired from. So you fired and moved, all day long. By early August, B Squadron wasn't following British doctrine anymore. They were fighting a different war, a farmer's war, and they were winning. The next 30 days became legend. From July 18th to August 18th, McLeod's crew and the reorganized B Squadron fought in every major battle: Operation Goodwood, Operation Spring, Operation Totalize, the Push to close the Falaise pocket, every single engagement. The numbers seemed impossible. McLeod's crew alone destroyed 134 Panzer, Mark IV and Panther tanks, 31 Tiger tanks, 15 self-propelled guns, 180 German armored vehicles total in exactly 30 days, with the same 5 men in the same tank. The number was so staggering that Allied command questioned the reports 3 times before accepting them. Other squadrons combined couldn't match what these 5 Canadians achieved. They were killing German tanks faster than the Germans could replace them. McLeod kept a notebook, every kill, every position, every lesson learned. The notebook filled with coordinates and times and tiny sketches of hedgerows and farm buildings. Other crews rotated men, replaced casualties, brought in fresh gunners and loaders. But McLeod's crew stayed together. The same 5 men: Rudolph, Moreau, Hall, White, McLeod. They moved like one organism now, no words needed. Just muscle memory and trust built from surviving together for 30 straight days. Other squadrons started keeping notebooks too. They shared McLeod's information. This position worked well. That approach got a crew killed. Learn from it. Adapt. Bomb took 2 direct hits during those 30 days. The first one struck the front glacis plate at an angle and bounced off, leaving a gouge in the armor deep enough to stick your fist in. The second hit the right track and blew 3 links apart. Both times, Hall and Moreau fixed the damage in the field. They used spare track links. They used wire from French farm fences. They used whatever worked. The Sherman kept running. The Germans adapted too. They started deploying Jag Panthers, massive tank destroyers, with guns that could kill a Sherman from 2,500 yards. They increased their infantry screens, sending foot soldiers ahead to spot hidden tanks. They launched attacks before dawn when the Canadians were supposed to be sleeping. McLeod countered by relocating every night. Never sleep in the same position twice. The Germans would shell the previous day's positions, wasting ammunition on empty fields, while B Squadron sat a mile away, eating cold rations and waiting for sunrise. August 8th arrived hot and dusty. The wheat was ready for harvest, but nobody was harvesting. The fields were torn up by tank tracks and shell craters. B Squadron moved to support a push near the village of Sinto. Intelligence said German armor was in the area, heavy armor. McLeod found a chateau at a place called La Jalousie. The building sat on a small rise with good sight lines down the main road. A stone wall 10 feet high surrounded the property. Perfect. His crew spent the night punching holes through that wall with sledgehammers and pickaxes. Brutal work that left their hands bleeding and their shoulders aching. But by dawn, they had firing ports that looked like decorative windows from the outside. 10 to 12 tanks from a squadron joined them. 2 were Fireflies, Shermans, with the big British 17-pound gun. Everyone positioned inside the chateau grounds, guns pointing at the road, waiting. The radio crackled at 12:30. Contact. Multiple Tigers heading your way from the southeast. At least 7 confirmed. McLeod felt sweat run down his back despite the morning chill. Tigers. Not the regular Panzer IVs they'd been killing. Real Tigers. 56 tons of armor and the deadliest tank gun in the world. And one of those Tigers was commanded by Michael Whitman. Everyone knew Whitman's name. The newspapers called him the Black Baron. 138 confirmed tank kills. He'd destroyed 14 British tanks in 15 minutes at a place called Villers-Bocage back in June. The man was a legend. German propaganda posters showed his face. Knight's Cross around his neck. Oak leaves added later. He was everything the Nazi war machine wanted to show the world. Now he was coming down this road. McLeod watched through his periscope. The ground rumbled, not from explosions, from the Tigers themselves. 7 of them rolling in a column, turrets swinging, commanders standing in their hatches scanning for threats. Behind them came more tanks, Panzer Mark IVs, half-tracks full of infantry, a Jagdpanther bringing up the rear. The lead Tiger was 500 yards out, 400, 300. McLeod's hand gripped the radio switch. His mouth was dry. Every instinct screamed to fire now, to shoot before the Tiger spotted them. But 500 yards wasn't close enough, not for a Tiger's front armor. 200 yards. The Tigers kept coming, totally unaware. They thought they owned this road. They thought no Allied tank would dare challenge them head-on. 150 yards. The lead Tiger's massive gun barrel swung left, then right, searching, not finding. The commander in the hatch held binoculars to his face. "Fire," McLeod said. Rudolph fired. The 75mm gun roared. Through the smoke and flame, McLeod saw the armor-piercing shell cross the distance in a heartbeat. It struck the Tiger's side armor just below the turret ring, the place where the armor was thinner, the place where ammunition was stored. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the Tiger erupted. The sound hit first, not the crack of bomb's gun firing. That was loud but expected. This was different. This was the sound of 75 tons of ammunition and fuel detonating at once. Moreau would later say it sounded like God slamming a door. The whole earth shook. Black smoke mushroomed 200 feet into the sky. Through the firing port in the stone wall, McLeod watched the Tiger's turret separate from the hull. 56 tons of metal, and the explosion had enough force to rip the turret completely off. It spun through the air like a coin flipped by a giant. It tumbled end over end, climbing higher than the chateau roof, then crashed down into a wheat field 300 feet away. The turret hit the ground upside down and bounced once before settling into the dirt. The turret landed in wheat, the same variety McLeod grew back home. He recognized the color. the way the stalks bent but didn't break. For a strange moment he thought about harvest, about how this field would never be harvested now, how the Turner family or whoever owned this land would plow around that turret for decades, because moving it would cost more than the land was worth. The other Tigers reversed frantically. Their commanders had seen what happened. They knew the lead tank was gone. They knew invisible guns were firing from somewhere close. Too close. At this range, their size and armor meant nothing. All around the chateau, Canadian guns opened fire. The Fireflies with their 17-pounders. The regular Shermans with 75s. 15 guns firing at once from 3 sides. The Tigers tried to return fire, but they couldn't see their targets. They fired at muzzle flashes and hit stone walls 3 feet thick. 8 minutes. That's how long the battle lasted. When the smoke cleared, 6 more German tanks sat burning. 2 more Tigers. 2 Panzer Mark IVs. 2 self-propelled guns. The rest of the column was retreating at full speed, leaving their dead behind. McLeod climbed out of bomb. His legs shook, his hands trembled. He'd just killed Michael Whitman, the Black Baron, the tank ace every German soldier wanted to be and every Allied soldier feared. Dead in a wheat field in France because he got too close to a Canadian farmer who understood ambushes. But the cost kept mounting. Of the 45 original Sherman commanders who landed on D-Day with the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, only 12 were still alive by mid-August, men McLeod had trained with. Men he'd shared cigarettes with. Gone. B Squadron started with 15 tanks. They were down to 5 that could still fight. The Americans kept using their textbook tactics. Engage at 800 yards with the newer 76mm guns. Better penetration than the 75, but still not enough. They were still losing 3 Shermans for every Tiger they killed. The British requested heavier tanks. Churchills with thicker armor. Cromwells with better speed. It didn't matter. Heavier armor meant slower speed. The Germans could still kill them from distance. Speed without protection just meant you died faster. Only the Canadian tactics worked. Only the close-range ambushes produced positive results. But positive results didn't mean no losses. Bomb had fired over 6,000 rounds by now. They'd burned through 2 engines, 2 complete sets of tracks. The inside of the turret was scorched black from muzzle flash and cordite smoke. White had a permanent ringing in his ears from the gun firing in enclosed spaces. Moreau had burns on his forearms from handling hot shell casings. Hall had bruises across his shoulders from being thrown against the driver's compartment during hits. Every night McLeod looked at his crew and wondered if tomorrow would be the day their luck ran out. Every morning they climbed back into bomb and went hunting, because someone had to, because the Germans weren't stopping, because 32 miles north Allied supply ships were unloading on beaches, and those supplies needed to reach the armies pushing east. The Sherman wasn't supposed to win this kind of fight. The experts said so, the statistics said so. But farmers don't listen to experts when the harvest needs bringing in. They do what works. They use what they have. They keep the machine running one more day. And bomb kept running. The war in Europe ended on May 8th, 1945. Bomb received the message over the radio while positioned near a German town nobody in the crew could pronounce. Hall shut down the engine. For the first time in 11 months, the rumble stopped. The silence felt wrong. Moreau climbed out of the turret and sat on the hull, crying. White just stared at nothing. Rudolph pulled out a photograph of his wife and kids, something he never did during combat because looking at it felt like bad luck. McLeod wrote in his notebook one last time. Bomb had traveled 2,500 miles from Juno Beach to Germany. It had fired over 6,000 rounds of ammunition. It had been credited with 180 German tank kills over those 30 legendary days in Normandy, the most kills by any single tank crew in the entire war. After Normandy, it destroyed dozens more armored vehicles through the rest of the campaign to Germany. It had taken 2 direct hits and 1 Panzerfaust rocket. It had never missed a single day of action, not one. The crew climbed down and stood together in the mud. They didn't say much. What was there to say? They'd survived when so many hadn't. That felt less like victory and more like guilt. The Canadian Army studied what happened. In 1946, officers interviewed MacLeod and the other surviving commanders. They wanted to understand how farmers and factory workers had killed more German armor than units with better training and fancier equipment. They filled notebooks with diagrams and measurements. They wrote reports with titles like Tactical Innovations in Close-Range Armor Engagement and Terrain Exploitation in Hedgerow Combat. The phrase that appeared most often in those reports was Close Ambush Doctrine. MacLeod's tactics had a name now, an official name. The Canadian Armored Corps added sections to their training manuals. New tank crews learned to read terrain. They learned to position before engaging. They learned that patience and position beat speed and firepower. By the 1950s, NATO tank forces were teaching similar tactics. American crews training for deployment to Germany studied the Normandy campaign. They watched films of Canadian Shermans engaging German armor from concealed positions. They practiced punching firing ports through walls. They learned that the ground mattered as much as the gun. Israeli tank forces in 1967 and 1973 credited Canadian tactical innovations in their own training. When Syrian tanks attacked across the Golan Heights, Israeli commanders used ambush tactics that looked remarkably similar to what MacLeod had developed in Norman orchards: hide, wait, strike from close range where armor advantage disappears. The principle worked in desert wadis the same way it worked in French hedgerows. The experts finally admitted what MacLeod had known all along. Technology alone doesn't win battles. Tactics win battles. Thinking wins battles. A smaller force that understands the ground can defeat a larger force that only understands doctrine. MacLeod came home in late 1945. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel before his discharge, recognition for his leadership and innovation. The medals came with the promotion: Distinguished Service Order for Extraordinary Leadership Under Fire, Military Cross for Gallantry in Combat. He packed them in a box and put the box in a closet. He never wore them, never talked about them. He went back to farming. 400 acres of wheat outside Sherbrooke, Quebec. The same land his father had farmed. The same land his grandfather had cleared from forest. He fixed tractors when they broke. He harvested wheat in the fall. He went to church on Sundays. He never spoke about the war. People in town knew he'd been in tanks. They knew he'd fought in Normandy. But MacLeod would change the subject if anyone asked. He'd talk about soil quality or wheat prices or whether the Canadians had a chance at the Stanley Cup. Anything but the war. The nightmares came at harvest time. The sound of the combine engine would sometimes become the sound of a Sherman engine. The smell of diesel fuel would bring him back to the turret. He'd see wheat fields and remember that field near Tsintho where Whitman's turret had landed. He'd work through it. Farmers don't stop working because of bad memories. In 1983, a French town held a ceremony. They were naming a park after Sidney Radley Walters, the Canadian tank ace who'd fought alongside MacLeod. Radley Walters had 18 confirmed kills, making him the top Allied tank ace of the war. The town invited all the surviving Sherbrooke Fusiliers. MacLeod flew to France for the first time since 1945. He was 67 years old now, gray hair, deep lines in his face from 38 years of sun and wind. He wore a suit, not his uniform. The uniform didn't fit anymore. At the ceremony, a French reporter asked him the question everyone wanted to know. How did farmers become such effective tank killers? How did you beat the German aces? McLeod was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the park they were dedicating, looked at the French soil that had soaked up so much blood, looked at the few other gray-haired men who'd survived. Tanks are just combines with guns, he said finally. You learn the ground, you respect the machine, you never get cocky. The Germans forgot that third rule. They thought their tigers made them invincible, but invincible is just another word for careless. The reporter wanted more, but McLeod was done talking. He walked to where Baum sat in the William Street Armory back in Sherbrooke. The tank had been preserved, brought home after the war. It sat there with its scarred armor and burned paint, a monument to reliability and survival. McLeod put his hand on the hull. The metal was cold. He remembered when it had been hot, scorching to touch after hours of combat. He remembered the smell of cordite and oil and sweat. He remembered Moreau loading shells with burns on his arms. He remembered white, steady hands on the gun controls. He remembered Hall coaxing the engine through one more mile, one more day. The lesson wasn't complicated. Wars aren't won by the biggest guns. They're won by people who understand that survival comes from seeing the battlefield differently than the enemy expects. McLeod had seen Normandy as his Quebec farm, ground to be known, used, respected. The Germans had seen it as terrain to dominate. They believed their superior tanks made them superior warriors. They forgot that a superior position beat superior equipment every single time. The same pattern repeated throughout history. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Ukraine in 2022. Smaller forces using terrain and tactics to defeat larger forces with better technology. The principle never changed. Position matters more than power. Knowledge matters more than equipment. Adaptation matters more than doctrine. By the time McLeod died in 1998, the world had changed completely. Computers, guided missiles, drones. Tanks had thermal sights and laser rangefinders and armor that could stop almost anything. But the fundamental truth remained unchanged. Technology is only as good as the person using it. Young tank commanders still learned about the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, still studied how one Canadian crew with the same 5 men had killed 180 German tanks in 30 days without rotating a single crew member. Still read McLeod's tactical reports looking for wisdom. The wisdom was simple. Experts see problems through doctrine, through textbooks, through what they were taught. Practitioners see solutions through experience, through trying things, through understanding that textbooks don't account for mud and fear and broken equipment. McLeod understood machinery because he'd spent his life fixing machinery. He understood ground because he'd spent his life working ground. He understood that you don't plow rocky soil and you don't fight tigers in open fields. Same principle, different application. In the wheat fields south of Caen, a Canadian farmer taught the world's finest tank forces something they should have learned from agriculture. The ground matters more than the plow. The farmer matters more than the tractor. And sometimes the person everyone dismisses as unqualified turns out to be exactly the person who can solve the impossible problem. Baum still sits in the Sherbrooke Armory. Kids on school trips press their faces against the glass and ask their teachers what makes this tank special. The teachers explain about D-Day and Normandy and fighting from June to May without missing a day. But the real answer is simpler. What makes Baum special is the same thing that makes any tool special. Not what it was made to do, what it actually did. And what it did was survive because 5 men understood that surviving meant thinking differently than everyone else. That's the lesson. That's always been the lesson. The person who wins isn't always the person with the best equipment. It's the person who uses what they have in ways nobody expected.